My fiancé admitted at our rehearsal dinner that he proposed as part of a reality show pitch to see if I'd stay after he revealed he was gay. Cameron stood up at our rehearsal dinner in front of 70 guests, including both our families, and tapped his wine glass for attention. I thought he was giving a toast and smiled at him from across the table at the vineyard where we'd be married the next day. Instead, he cleared his throat and said he had something important to confess before we got married. His voice was steady and loud enough that everyone stopped talking and turned to listen. He said he'd been living a lie for the past 2 years, that he'd proposed to me as part of a reality show concept he'd been pitching to networks, and that the whole relationship had been designed to see if I'd stay with him after he revealed he was actually attracted to men instead of women. The room went completely silent. My mother dropped her fork and it clattered against her plate. Cameron's father stood up looking confused and angry. My sister grabbed my hand under the table. Cameron continued speaking and said the production company wanted authentic reactions to betrayal and that I'd been the perfect candidate because I was so trusting and emotionally invested. He said he was sorry, but the show had been greenlit and would air in 6 months, documenting our entire relationship with hidden cameras and staged moments. I couldn't process what was happening. My brain refused to accept the words coming out of Cameron's mouth. We'd been together for 2 years, engaged for 8 months, and I'd never suspected anything was fake. He'd proposed on a beach in Maui during sunset with a custom ring he'd designed with my birthstone. We'd planned this wedding for months, chosen flowers and caterers, and sent invitations to 200 guests. My dress was hanging in the bridal suite upstairs waiting for tomorrow morning. Everything had felt real and genuine and full of love. Cameron was still talking and explaining that he'd signed a contract with Apex Entertainment that required him to maintain the deception until the rehearsal dinner to capture my reaction on the hidden cameras placed throughout the venue. He pointed to small black devices mounted in corners of the room that I'd assumed were part of the vineyard's security system. He said the cameras had been recording us for weeks, including intimate moments in our apartment and private conversations I'd thought were just between us. My chest felt tight and I couldn't breathe properly. My sister was saying something, but I couldn't hear her over the ringing in my ears. Cameron's mother started crying and demanding to know if this was some kind of joke. Cameron shook his head and said it wasn't a joke, that he'd been paid $100,000 up front with more money promised once the show aired, and that his real partner Marcus would be joining him after the wedding was canceled to explain how they'd met and fallen in love while Cameron was pretending to be engaged to me. My father stood up so fast his chair fell backward and he started walking toward Cameron with his fists clenched. My uncle grabbed my father's arm and held him back while Cameron kept explaining the premise of the show called Fake Love, which would expose how easily people could be manipulated by someone they trusted. He said I'd signed a release form when we first started dating that I'd thought was for his photography portfolio, but had actually been consent for filming. I tried to remember signing anything and couldn't. Everything felt surreal and impossible. My best friend Olivia was yelling at Cameron, calling him a psychopath and demanding he stop talking. The venue coordinator was standing in the doorway looking panicked and asking if she should call security. I finally found my voice and asked Cameron if anything about our relationship had been real. He looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, cold and calculated, and said the whole point was that nothing had been real. Every date, every conversation, every time he'd said he loved me had been scripted or improvised for the show. He said he was a struggling actor who'd been cast in this role and had performed it well enough to convince everyone, including my family, that he was a genuine person capable of love. He pulled out his phone and started showing people on the screen what he claimed was footage of planning meetings with producers where they'd discussed my personality and how to manipulate me most effectively. My mother was sobbing and my father was still trying to get past my uncle to reach Cameron. Cameron's father was yelling that his son had lost his mind and this wasn't real. But Cameron insisted it was real, that the show was happening, that cameras had documented everything, and that I should be grateful for the opportunity to be famous even if it meant being humiliated on national television. He said the producers wanted to film my reaction tomorrow when I'd expected to get married, and instead would be dealing with the aftermath of this betrayal. I stood up on legs that felt like they might collapse and told Cameron he was a monster. My voice came out stronger than I expected and echoed in the silent room. I said if any of what he'd said was true, he'd destroyed my life for entertainment and money, and I would never forgive him or participate in his show. I pulled off my engagement ring and threw it at him. It bounced off his chest and fell to the floor. Cameron bent down to pick it up and said the ring was actually rented from a prop company and he needed to return it. That detail broke something in me and I started laughing because it was so absurd and cruel that even the ring had been fake. My sister put her arm around me and started leading me toward the exit. Other guests were standing up and some were yelling at Cameron while others were filming everything on their phones. Cameron called after me and said the cameras needed me to stay so they could capture the full emotional arc of the betrayal. I kept walking without looking back. My father broke free from my uncle and I heard a commotion behind me that sounded like violence, but I didn't turn around to see what happened. My sister drove me to her apartment because I couldn't go back to the place I'd shared with Cameron for the past year. I sat on her couch in my rehearsal dinner dress while Olivia brought me tea and my mother made phone calls canceling the wedding ceremony scheduled for the next morning. Over 300 people needed to be notified that the wedding was off. The venue needed to be canceled. The caterer, the florist, the photographer, the band, all of it needed to be undone. My mother was crying while making these calls and apologizing to vendors who'd already done preparation work. My sister was searching online for any information about a show called Fake Love or Apex Entertainment. She found nothing. No production company by that name, no show in development, no casting notices or press releases. She showed me her phone and said Cameron might have been lying about the show itself, that maybe this was a different kind of deception than he'd claimed. I didn't understand what that meant or why it mattered. Whether there was a show or not, Cameron had stood up in front of everyone we knew and destroyed our relationship deliberately and publicly. Olivia said we needed to call the police because what Cameron had described sounded illegal. Secret filming in private spaces without consent violated recording laws. If he really had cameras in our apartment capturing intimate moments, that was criminal surveillance. My father arrived at my sister's apartment with scraped knuckles and said he'd hit Cameron 3 times before venue security separated them and asked both families to leave. He said Cameron had been taken to the hospital for a possible broken nose, but was conscious and still insisting the show was real. My father had spoken to Cameron's father in the parking lot, and Cameron's father had said he had no idea his son was capable of this level of deception, that Cameron had never mentioned a show or being anything other than genuinely in love with me. My father's voice broke when he said he felt like he'd failed to protect me from a predator who'd been living in our lives for 2 years. I told my father none of this was his fault and Cameron had fooled all of us. My mother hung up from canceling vendors and said we needed a lawyer immediately because if there really were hidden cameras, we needed to prevent any footage from being used or distributed. My sister found an attorney named Rebecca Holt who specialized in privacy law and entertainment litigation. Rebecca agreed to meet with us on Saturday morning even though it was supposed to have been my wedding day. I sat in her conference room wearing jeans and a sweater I'd borrowed from my sister because all my clothes were still at the apartment I'd shared with Cameron. Rebecca asked me to tell her everything that had happened and I walked her through the rehearsal dinner, Cameron's confession, his claims about the show and the cameras, and his statement that I'd signed a release form. Rebecca took detailed notes and asked clarifying questions about exactly what Cameron had said regarding the show's premise, the production company, the payment he'd received, and his partner Marcus. When I finished, Rebecca leaned back in her chair and said something didn't add up about Cameron's story. If this was a legitimate reality show, there would be legal protocols, multiple release forms, insurance requirements, and formal production contracts. The way Cameron had described it sounded more like an elaborate excuse than an actual television production. Rebecca asked if I'd seen any evidence of Cameron being attracted to men during our relationship. I said no, never. Our intimate life had been normal and frequent. He'd never mentioned questioning his sexuality or being interested in anyone named Marcus. Rebecca made a note and said Cameron might have fabricated the entire story about being attracted to men and the reality show as an excuse to escape the relationship without taking responsibility for simply not wanting to marry me. She said some people created elaborate lies when they got cold feet about marriage because they couldn't face the social consequences of just being honest about their feelings. I felt anger rising in my chest and said if Cameron just wanted to break up, he could have done it privately instead of publicly humiliating me in front of our families and friends. Rebecca agreed and said the public nature of his confession suggested something else was motivating him, possibly a psychological need for attention or a desire to hurt me specifically rather than just end the relationship. She asked if Cameron had ever been cruel or manipulative before the rehearsal dinner. I thought about our 2 years together and realized there had been small things I'd dismissed or rationalized. Times when he'd criticized my appearance and then claimed he was trying to help me. Occasions when he'd isolated me from friends by making plans that conflicted with theirs. Moments when he'd made me feel like my reactions were over-emotional or irrational. I told Rebecca about these incidents and she asked if Cameron had ever worked in entertainment or acting. I said he'd mentioned wanting to be an actor when he was younger, but worked in corporate marketing now. He'd never been involved in any actual productions or auditions during our relationship. Rebecca said that made sense because legitimate production companies didn't hire inexperienced actors for elaborate hidden camera shows without extensive vetting and legal protection. She said we needed to find out if Cameron really had placed cameras in our apartment, and if so, what footage existed. She'd file an emergency motion on Monday morning seeking an injunction to prevent any distribution of recorded material and demanding Cameron provide all recordings for review. If he'd recorded me without consent in private spaces, especially intimate moments, that violated state privacy laws and could result in criminal charges. Rebecca also wanted to investigate whether Marcus was a real person or another fabrication. She asked me to make a list of everyone Cameron had mentioned by name during his confession and any details I could remember about the alleged production company. I agreed and spent the rest of the meeting answering questions about our relationship, our finances, and whether Cameron had access to any of my personal accounts or information. My sister and I went back to the apartment I'd shared with Cameron on Sunday afternoon with my father and uncle as protection. Cameron wasn't there, but his belongings were still present. We searched the apartment looking for cameras and found 3 small devices hidden in the living room, bedroom, and bathroom. My father carefully removed them, and we documented everything with photos. In Cameron's home office, my sister found a laptop that wasn't password protected. She opened it and started going through files while I packed my belongings. She called me over after 10 minutes and showed me what she'd found. The laptop contained folders labeled with dates going back 2 years. Inside were videos recorded from multiple angles showing me in the apartment, going about my daily life, getting dressed, having conversations with friends on the phone, intimate moments with Cameron that made me feel sick to see captured on camera. There were also documents that appeared to be notes about my behavior, my insecurities, my relationships with my family, and my financial information. My sister said this wasn't preparation for a reality show. This was stalking and surveillance that had been going on for years. We called Rebecca immediately and she said to stop touching anything and call the police. 2 officers arrived within 30 minutes and I explained what we'd found. They secured the laptop and the cameras as evidence and took statements from all of us. One officer said what Cameron had done was potentially criminal harassment, unauthorized surveillance, and depending on the content of the recordings, could involve other charges related to privacy violations. They asked if I knew where Cameron was currently, and I said he'd been taken to the hospital Friday night, but I didn't know if he'd been released. The officer said they'd locate him and bring him in for questioning. They asked if I felt safe and whether Cameron had ever been violent or threatening. I said the rehearsal dinner confession was the first time he'd been openly cruel, but looking back, I could see patterns of manipulation and control throughout our relationship. The officer gave me information about protective orders and victim services. After they left, my father helped me finish packing while my sister made copies of everything on Cameron's laptop before the police came back for it. I stayed with my sister for the next week while Rebecca worked on the legal case and police investigated Cameron's surveillance. Rebecca called me Wednesday morning and said she'd received a response from an attorney representing Cameron. The attorney's name was David Sterling, and he'd sent a letter claiming Cameron had not broken any laws, that any recordings made in a shared residence were legal, and that I had consented to filming through a release I'd signed 2 years ago. Rebecca said she'd demanded copies of this alleged release and was filing motions to compel production of all recorded material. She also said the police had interviewed Cameron and he was maintaining his story about the reality show, though he'd refused to provide any contact information for Apex Entertainment or anyone named Marcus. The police had found no evidence that Apex Entertainment existed as a registered business entity. Rebecca said this strengthened her theory that Cameron had fabricated the entire reality show story, possibly to cover up different motivations for his surveillance and betrayal. I asked what other motivations there could be, and Rebecca said she wanted to investigate Cameron's finances and see if there was a monetary angle we were missing. My best friend Olivia spent hours going through social media trying to find any mention of Cameron being involved in entertainment production or knowing anyone named Marcus. She found nothing. Cameron's social media showed a normal life of someone working in marketing, posting about our relationship, sharing photos from vacations we'd taken together, and interacting with mutual friends. There was no indication he'd been living a double life or planning to reveal some secret. Olivia did find something strange, though. Cameron had received multiple large cash deposits into his bank account over the past year, totaling around $80,000. She'd accessed this information through a shared banking app we'd all used for splitting expenses on a group trip 6 months ago, and Cameron had never removed her access. She screenshot everything and sent it to me. The deposits were labeled as transfers from LK Enterprises. I'd never heard of that company, and Cameron had never mentioned receiving that kind of money. I forwarded the screenshots to Rebecca, who said this could be significant evidence of some kind of financial scheme that had nothing to do with a reality show. Rebecca's investigator tracked down LK Enterprises to a consulting firm owned by someone named Leonard Kramer. Leonard Kramer was a fraud specialist who'd been investigated previously for running elaborate scams where he'd help people fake their own deaths or create false narratives to escape debt or relationships. He'd never been charged with crimes but had been named in several civil suits. Rebecca called me and said she thought Cameron might have hired Kramer to help him create an exit strategy from our relationship, possibly because he'd gotten cold feet about marriage or was involved with someone else and wanted a dramatic excuse that would make him look like a victim, rather than someone who'd simply cheated or lost interest. The reality show story and the claim about being attracted to men were potentially fabricated to generate sympathy and deflect blame. Rebecca said we needed to find out who Cameron might be involved with and whether that person knew about the plan to destroy our relationship publicly. I felt rage building thinking that Cameron had paid someone $80,000 to help him torture me psychologically instead of just being honest. My sister contacted Cameron's closest friend Wesley, who'd been at the rehearsal dinner and had looked genuinely shocked by Cameron's confession. Wesley agreed to meet with my sister at a coffee shop and she recorded their conversation on her phone. Wesley said Cameron had been acting strange for about 6 months, becoming secretive and taking phone calls in private. Wesley had assumed Cameron was planning elaborate wedding surprises for me. But a few weeks before the rehearsal dinner, Cameron had mentioned being stressed about something, and when Wesley pressed him, Cameron had said he was going to do something that would change everything, but wouldn't explain what he meant. Wesley said Cameron had never mentioned being attracted to men, never talked about anyone named Marcus, and had seemed genuinely happy in our relationship until the last 6 months. Wesley said after the rehearsal dinner, he'd tried calling Cameron multiple times, but Cameron wasn't responding. He'd also reached out to Cameron's family, who were devastated and confused. Wesley said Cameron's mother had told him that Cameron had always been straight as far as she knew, and had dated several women before me without ever questioning his sexuality. The police investigation moved forward, and detectives obtained a warrant to search Cameron's apartment more thoroughly. They found additional storage devices containing months of recordings showing me in private moments when I'd thought I was alone. They also found a contract between Cameron and Leonard Kramer's company, outlining services provided for creating a believable exit narrative, including coaching on delivery, documentation of false claims, and strategies for managing aftermath. The contract specifically mentioned the goal of ending the relationship in a way that generated maximum sympathy for Cameron while making me appear unstable or desperate if I tried to contest his version of events. Reading that contract in Rebecca's office made me realize Cameron hadn't just wanted to leave me. He'd wanted to destroy my credibility and reputation as part of leaving. Rebecca said this level of premeditated cruelty suggested serious psychological problems, and we should pursue both criminal charges and a civil lawsuit for intentional infliction of emotional distress. Cameron was arrested Thursday afternoon and charged with illegal surveillance, harassment, and computer crimes related to unauthorized recording of intimate acts. His bail was set at $50,000, and he remained in jail for 3 days before his family posted it. David Sterling held a press conference after Cameron's release, claiming his client was the victim of a vindictive ex-fiancé who was trying to criminalize a reality show that had been legitimately contracted and filmed. Sterling produced a document he claimed was my signed release form authorizing filming. Rebecca immediately issued a statement calling the release fraudulent and saying handwriting experts would prove I'd never signed it. The story started getting media attention, with headlines about a jilted bride accusing her ex-fiancé of running an elaborate scam. I was horrified to see my name and photo in news articles describing the situation without having the full context of Cameron's surveillance and manipulation. Rebecca advised me not to speak to media directly, but she'd be releasing a detailed statement with evidence of Cameron's criminal behavior. The preliminary hearing happened 3 weeks later, and I attended with my entire family. Cameron sat at the defense table looking thin and exhausted. David Sterling argued that the surveillance charges should be dismissed because Cameron had been recording in his own home, and any intimate recordings had been for personal use, not distribution. The prosecutor presented evidence of the contract with Leonard Kramer, showing premeditated planning to deceive me as part of an exit strategy, not a reality show. They showed the laptop folders documenting years of surveillance and note-taking about my behavior. They presented testimony from the police investigator who'd found no evidence that Apex Entertainment existed or that any reality show was in development. They revealed that Marcus, the partner Cameron claimed to have, didn't exist as a real person, and Cameron had never provided any contact information for him despite multiple requests. The judge reviewed everything and ruled there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial on all charges. She also noted that Cameron's claim about a reality show appeared to be false and potentially part of the criminal activity itself, rather than a defense. David Sterling held another press conference after the hearing, claiming the prosecution was biased and trying to criminalize reality television production. But reporters started investigating his claims and found inconsistencies. Entertainment lawyers interviewed on news programs said legitimate reality shows didn't operate the way Cameron had described, and production companies were always registered business entities with insurance and legal compliance. One investigative journalist named Yolanda Reeves started digging into Leonard Kramer's history and published an article exposing his pattern of helping clients create false narratives to escape relationships or financial obligations. The article included interviews with 3 other people who'd hired Kramer and had similar experiences where elaborate lies were constructed to provide cover for betrayal or abandonment. Yolanda interviewed me, and I told her the full story of the rehearsal dinner, the surveillance, the manipulation, and Cameron's use of a fake claim about his sexuality as part of his excuse. The article generated significant attention, and public opinion shifted dramatically against Cameron. Cameron's family contacted my family asking if there was any way to resolve this without trial. Cameron's father said he'd spoken with his son, and Cameron had admitted the reality show story was false, that he'd gotten scared about marriage and had hired Kramer to help him create a dramatic exit that would make him look like a victim of circumstance rather than someone who'd simply gotten cold feet. He said Cameron was in therapy now and realized what he'd done was wrong. He wanted to apologize and make amends. My father said an apology wasn't enough after Cameron had surveilled me for years, planned psychological torture, and tried to destroy my reputation. Cameron's father said he understood and his family would support whatever legal consequences resulted from Cameron's actions. He said they were ashamed and heartbroken about what their son had done. That conversation was recorded and provided to Rebecca, who said it could be used as evidence of admission if Cameron tried to maintain his innocence at trial. The trial started 4 months after the rehearsal dinner. I testified about our relationship, the proposal, the wedding planning, and the devastating confession at the rehearsal dinner. I explained how I'd believed everything was real and had no reason to suspect Cameron was lying about his feelings or his identity. The prosecutor showed the jury recordings from Cameron's hidden cameras displaying my private moments without my knowledge or consent. They showed the folders documenting my behavior and insecurities. They presented the contract with Leonard Kramer outlining the plan to create a false narrative. They brought in expert witnesses who testified about the psychological impact of this kind of sustained deception and surveillance. Cameron's defense was weak because David Sterling couldn't produce any evidence that a reality show existed or that Cameron's claims had been legitimate. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and found Cameron guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 3 years in prison and ordered him to pay restitution of $200,000 for emotional damages and therapy costs. Rebecca filed a civil lawsuit on my behalf seeking additional damages for intentional infliction of emotional distress, fraud, and invasion of privacy. The civil case was stronger because the burden of proof was lower, and we had extensive documentation of Cameron's premeditated campaign to hurt me. Cameron's attorney tried to negotiate a settlement, but Rebecca refused anything less than $1 million. She said Cameron had proven himself to be a calculating predator who'd spent years planning how to maximize my pain, and his settlement needed to reflect the severity of what he'd done. The civil trial happened 8 months after the criminal trial and lasted 2 weeks. I testified again about the emotional devastation of learning my entire relationship had been monitored and manipulated. My therapist testified about PTSD symptoms I'd developed and ongoing trust issues. My family testified about watching me be destroyed publicly and their own trauma from believing they'd known and trusted Cameron. The jury awarded me $1.3 million in compensatory and punitive damages. Cameron's attorney appealed, but the appeals court upheld the verdict. I used some of the settlement money to move to a different city and start over. I enrolled in graduate school studying psychology because I wanted to understand manipulation and help other people recognize predatory behavior in relationships. I started a blog sharing my story and received hundreds of messages from people who'd experienced similar betrayals where partners had fabricated elaborate lies to excuse cruelty or escape commitment. I connected with domestic violence organizations and started speaking about emotional abuse and the importance of recognizing manipulation patterns. My story became part of training materials used by therapists and law enforcement to identify psychological abuse. 2 years after the rehearsal dinner, I was in a healthier place emotionally and had learned to trust my instincts again. I met someone new who was patient with my healing process and transparent about his life in ways Cameron had never been. Cameron remained in prison, and I never contacted him or responded to letters he sent attempting to apologize. His apologies felt empty and self-serving, more about reducing his guilt than acknowledging the magnitude of harm he'd caused. 3 years after the rehearsal dinner, I stood at my actual wedding to someone who'd proven through consistent honesty that he was exactly who he claimed to be. My sister was my maid of honor, and my father walked me down the aisle without the fear that had haunted him since Cameron's betrayal. As I exchanged vows with someone who saw me as a partner rather than a target, I felt grateful that Cameron's confession had happened before I'd legally tied myself to him forever. The pain had been excruciating, but escaping that marriage had saved my life from years of continued manipulation and control. Sometimes the worst betrayals lead us toward the truth we needed to find. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.